General Hospital will reveal inside the somber walls of the Port Charles courthouse, what began as a seemingly standard custody hearing between Michael and Willow rapidly evolved into a searing unraveling of betrayals, hidden agendas, and scandalous truths that sent shockwaves far beyond the courtroom. The case was initially framed around the welfare and future of two innocent children, Wiley and Amelia. But as the proceedings unfolded, the room became a crucible of long-buried secrets erupting under oath, turning what should have been a matter of parental rights into a public dissection of moral decay, romantic deceit, and psychological warfare. As Michael sat stoically with his legal counsel, and Willow anxiously awaited the verdict that would determine her fate as a mother, no one could have predicted that the most damning blows would come not from the judge's gavel but from the testimonies of those closest to them. When Carly took the witness stand, the temperature in the room dropped. Dressed with precision and her expression unreadable, she wasted no time in delivering a blistering narrative of events that had long been whispered about but never confirmed. Her voice did not quiver. She stated with piercing clarity that Nina had, with premeditation and malice, drugged Drew with ketamine, a truth Carly had pieced together from digital communications, eyewitness testimony, and the eventual confession Nina had carelessly offered in a moment of misplaced trust. The weight of her words was undeniable, reinforced by recovered email chains, surveillance footage from a hotel bar, and the sworn affidavit of Portia, who had been unwittingly drawn into Nina's complex web of revenge. Sitting silently near the back of the courtroom was Rick Lansing, eyes sharpened like a predator circling wounded prey. He had been waiting for a crack in the story, a moment when the scales would tip. That moment came swiftly. Rising with calculated calm, Rick began cross-examining Drew, inching closer and closer to a revelation that would upend the courtroom. What came next felt like a punch to the collective gut of everyone present. Drew didn't deny the allegations. In fact, under oath, and pressed by irrefutable evidence, Drew admitted to not only being aware of Nina's role in orchestrating the ketamine incident but also to having engaged in a deeply inappropriate and covert relationship with her throughout the period in question. What made the air in the courtroom grow heavy with disbelief wasn't just the confirmation of this illicit affair, it was the underlying current of complicity. Drew knew. He knew Nina had manipulated Jacinda into luring him into a trap. He knew the drugs were not an accident but a calculated move in a much larger scheme. And still, he remained silent, protecting himself, his ego, and, to some degree, Nina, even as the truth corroded everything he had once stood for. Emails between Nina and a shady intermediary, voice messages laden with veiled threats, and even receipts linked to Jacinda's disappearance, painted a sinister portrait of a relationship steeped in mutual manipulation, not love. Portia's testimony further darkened the mood, confirming that she had been misled into believing she was aiding in a mental health intervention, only to discover she had been a pawn in a vicious vendetta against Carly. Yet, the most volatile revelation exploded not from Carly, Rick, or Drew, but when the judge demanded that Nina herself clarify her motivations. With the entire courtroom watching, Nina stood, visibly shaken, caught between her practiced poise and the emotional collapse brewing beneath the surface. Her voice faltered at first, but soon the words spilled out, raw, resentful, and damning. She confessed that she had discovered Drew was covertly recording their private conversations, intending to leak them to Sonny. The betrayal was not merely romantic, it was strategic. She felt used, exploited as a pawn in the eternal power struggle between the men of Port Charles. That realization, she said, drove her to the edge. Consumed by humiliation and the need to regain control, Nina decided to retaliate, not by confronting Drew or ending the relationship, but by orchestrating his fall from grace. But her vengeance didn't stop with Drew. Nina admitted that Carly had always been her true target, the woman she could never match, never escape. Carly had haunted every corner of her relationship with Sonny, every failure as a mother, and every comparison whispered behind her back. In a twisted attempt to reclaim dignity and power, she decided that if Drew fell, Carly would be dragged down with him. The ketamine incident was never about addiction, intervention, or concern. It was a surgical strike, designed to destabilize, humiliate, and destroy. Nina had orchestrated everything, Jacinda, the drugs, the cover-up, with chilling precision. But now, in front of the gavel and God, her confession stood naked, as monstrous as it was pathetic. Gasps erupted throughout the room. The judge's gavel pounded repeatedly, but the courtroom had already descended into quiet chaos. Michael sat motionless, a storm of vindication behind his eyes. His silence screamed louder than any outburst ever could. He had lost Willow to Drew once, had watched his family fracture under the weight of that betrayal, had suffered in silence while being branded unfit. But now, the world saw the truth. Drew was no savior. He was a man who slept with Willow's mother and then conspired to ruin her family. Nina wasn't a misguided grandmother. She was an architect of destruction whose hatred knew no boundaries. And Willow, caught in the eye of the storm, was left obliterated. Every breath she took felt like glass in her lungs. She had left Michael for Drew. She had chosen him despite every warning. She had allowed Nina to inch back into her life, believing that love and family could conquer all. But now, with the truth strewn across the courtroom like shattered glass, she could no longer deny that her trust had been a fatal miscalculation. The man she gave everything to had violated not only her, but the sanctity of motherhood, of decency. And the woman she had longed to reconnect with had weaponized that longing into something poisonous and irrevocable. It didn't take long for the court to respond. In a stunning interim ruling, the judge suspended Willow's custody rights pending a full psychological review. Wiley and Amelia were awarded to Michael, whose consistent record, composed demeanor, and protective instinct now painted him as the only viable guardian. Drew was ordered into custody for obstruction and collusion, pending further investigation. Nina was referred for psychological evaluation and could face charges for conspiracy and reckless endangerment. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind an eerie quiet. Carly walked out with her head held high. Michael followed, a child in each arm. Willow remained seated, tears silently tracing the destruction of everything she thought she had rebuilt. And as for Nina, no longer the misunderstood mother or doting grandmother, she was now the embodiment of a cautionary tale, that vengeance, once uncaged, consumes not only its targets but the one who sets it loose. However, when every secret had been laid bare, when the veils of deceit had been torn from even the most intimate of relationships, the price to be paid proved far greater than anyone could have imagined. The revelation of Nina and Drew's clandestine affair didn't just shock the courtroom, it fractured the delicate web of connections that once held the lives of several families in fragile balance. The consequences rippled outward with brutal precision, touching everyone who had ever placed their trust in either of them. And at the heart of that devastation stood Willow, whose world collapsed in a silence more deafening than any outburst. Once, Willow had loved Drew deeply, defiantly, even, casting aside the warnings of both Michael and Carly, convinced that what she shared with him was genuine, healing, and honest. She had fought to believe that Drew was a new beginning, someone who could carry her and her children into a brighter future. But now, seated in the courtroom as the grim truth spilled like poison into every corner, she was forced to face a reality too cruel to deny. Not only had she lost Michael, the man who once stood beside her through so much, but she had also been deceived by the man she thought would never betray her. Drew had not only colluded with Nina to orchestrate a scandal that endangered their family's reputation, he had slept with her mother. Worse still, Willow's silence in the face of the mounting suspicion about Nina and Drew's relationship cast an even darker shadow over her role as a mother. In protecting them, in turning a blind eye to their recklessness and manipulations, she had become complicit. Not in their crimes, but in allowing their toxic behavior to linger unchecked in her children's lives. The court, once sympathetic to her position, now questioned her judgment, her moral compass, and ultimately, her fitness to act in the best interests of Wiley and Amelia. Everything she had worked to build, her identity as a devoted mother, a stable parental figure, a woman of integrity, crumbled in seconds. Her eyes, once filled with hope and resilience, now brimmed with the quiet devastation of a person watching everything slip irreversibly from her grasp. The judge, after consulting briefly with court-appointed child welfare advocates, delivered a decision that seemed both inevitable and heartbreaking. Willow's parental rights were to be suspended pending a full psychological assessment and a comprehensive evaluation by a court-assigned social worker. Temporary sole custody of both children was immediately transferred to Michael, whose composed demeanor and history of consistent, responsible parenting offered the court a safer, more stable path forward for the children's well-being. The ruling struck Willow like a blow to the chest. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. But her body sagged under the weight of finality, and her soul seemed to collapse inward as the reality of her loss took hold. Michael, for his part, remained stoic. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. But in his eyes shone the unmistakable gleam of vindication, a silent acknowledgement that, after months of humiliation, betrayal, and having his fatherhood questioned, the truth had prevailed. Holding Wiley's hand in one and cradling Amelia gently in the other, Michael exited the courtroom with quiet strength. His steps were firm, his back straight, not with arrogance, but with the pride of a father who had done what needed to be done. Not just to reclaim his children, but to protect them from a future built on lies. This was not just a legal victory. It was a restoration of dignity, of clarity, and of peace for two young souls caught in a storm they never asked for. Carly walked just behind him, her face composed yet unmistakably proud. She had stood by Michael not just as a mother, but as a fierce protector of truth. She had put herself on the line to expose Nina's lies, to make sure her grandchildren grew up in an environment grounded in love, not manipulation. In the end, it was Carly's persistence, her refusal to be gaslit or silenced, that brought the most damning truths to light. She had not allowed Michael to fight this battle alone, and her unwavering strength had become a shield for him in the most tumultuous of times. Now, as she watched her son walk out of the courtroom with his children in his arms, she knew her sacrifices had not been in vain. Meanwhile, Drew was taken into temporary custody, not only for obstruction of justice but also for suspicion of evidence tampering and collusion. His fall from grace was as swift as it was complete. The once respected figure, lauded for his leadership and self-control, now found himself shackled, physically and metaphorically, by the consequences of his choices. He didn't look back at Willow as he was led away. Whether it was out of shame or indifference, no one could tell. But that final act of detachment spoke volumes to Willow, who realized, too late, that she had fallen in love with a man who had never truly seen her, let alone protected her. As for Nina, she sat frozen in her seat, isolated and broken. Once surrounded by allies, she now faced a sea of cold, judgmental stares from every corner of the room. Those who once gave her the benefit of the doubt now regarded her as a manipulator, a woman whose need for control and vengeance had torn apart lives, including that of her own daughter. The shame that colored her cheeks wasn't just personal, it was public, searing, and irreversible. She had lost everything, her influence, her dignity, and perhaps worst of all, the last fragile thread of her relationship with Willow. Willow remained seated long after the courtroom had emptied, her body motionless, her mind adrift in the wreckage. The mother, the wife, the woman she thought she was had been left behind in that courtroom, buried under the weight of her own denial and misplaced trust. The children she had once tucked in at night now lay in someone else's arms. The man she had believed in turned out to be the catalyst for her ruin. And the mother she had hoped to reconnect with proved herself unworthy of even a second chance. This was no longer just a custody battle. It was a reckoning. And as the final echoes of the judge's gavel faded into silence, Willow realized the full cost of aligning herself with deception, the loss of everything she held dear. Willow remained behind, seated in the now silent courtroom that just hours earlier had been a battleground of revelations and betrayals. The echo of the gavel still lingered faintly in the hollow air, but the room itself, stripped of voices, stripped of movement, had become a haunting monument to everything she had lost. It had once been a place where she believed truth would prevail, where her love for her children and her attempts at rebuilding a broken life would be enough to prove that she deserved to be their guardian, their anchor. But that hope had crumbled beneath the weight of secrets too ugly to ignore and choices too damaging to undo. Every tear she hadn't allowed herself to shed in the courtroom now threatened to pour as her body sat frozen, her mind spinning with regret. What haunted Willow most wasn't just the ruling, though it had struck her with the cold finality of a closed door, it was the brutal clarity with which the court and those around her had seen the truth that she herself had refused to face. She had once believed that walking away from Michael and choosing Drew had been an act of courage, of reclaiming agency over her life. She had told herself she was following love, that she was building something pure out of the ashes of a marriage that had suffered under pressure and tragedy. But now, in the sterile quiet of the courtroom, she saw that path for what it truly was, a delusion. Drew hadn't been a second chance. He hadn't even been a safe harbor. He had been a mirage, a mask hiding opportunism, duplicity, and eventually, betrayal of the worst kind. Not only had he used her emotionally, luring her into a relationship that made her abandon her marriage and strain her ties with Carly and Michael, but he had also crossed an unforgivable line, one that shattered every remaining illusion. The man she loved had been physically involved with her own mother. Nina. The very woman Willow had fought to forgive, fought to let back into her life, believing that somewhere beneath the years of conflict there still existed the possibility of a mother-daughter bond. That hope, like all the others, now lay in pieces on the floor at her feet. The images flooded her memory like shards of broken glass, Nina and Drew's stolen glances, the nights Drew came home late, the way Nina always defended him in public and private alike. The courtroom's revelation hadn't just embarrassed her, it had dismantled her from the inside out. She had been betrayed not by a villain, but by two people she had once trusted with her most vulnerable self. The pain cut deeper than rage. It was a hollow, consuming ache, the kind that made it hard to breathe, to think, to move. And as she sat in the emptiness of that courtroom, she realized something so devastating that it robbed her of even the energy to cry. Sometimes, the deepest wounds don't come from enemies, they come from those who once held your heart in their hands. The courtroom had been her last stand. She had walked in hopeful, desperate, clinging to the idea that her love as a mother would be enough. But love had not saved her. The truth had not been in her favor. Her silence in the face of Drew and Nina's schemes, her complicity in allowing those lies to flourish, her blindness to betrayal. All of it had disqualified her from the very role she had fought to protect. The judge's voice still rang in her ears, custody suspended, parental fitness under review, mandatory psychological evaluation. Words that, days ago, would have been unimaginable. Words that now echoed with damning permanence. Outside the courtroom, the world continued on. Michael had walked away with their children, his quiet dignity cutting deeper than any shouted accusation. Carly had followed, her loyalty as unshakable as ever. Even Drew, escorted away in handcuffs, had managed to carry with him a twisted kind of closure, at least his lies were now out in the open. But Willow remained alone, surrounded by chairs that no longer held witnesses or legal teams, by papers strewn across tables that no longer held her defense. There was no one left to argue for her. No one left to comfort her. No more second chances. The preview for General Hospital for the week of June 2nd to June 6th had promised explosive revelations, courtroom showdowns, and life-changing outcomes. But no viewer, no character, least of all Willow, had anticipated the depth of devastation these truths would deliver. In a town like Port Charles, where secrets are currency and power is traded like stock, it was easy to forget the human cost of betrayal. But this trial had reminded everyone that there is always a price. And for those who reach too high while standing on the lies of others, the fall is merciless. Willow had once believed in redemption. She had believed that love, motherhood, and honesty would guide her through the darkness. But honesty had arrived too late. Now, stripped of custody, dignity, and the fragile hope of reconciling with the mother who had always let her down, she faced a future built not on possibility, but on the wreckage of choices that could not be taken back. She had no illusions left. No comforting lies. Only silence, and the devastating knowledge that, in the end, she had not only lost everything but had helped pave the way to her own undoing. And as the courtroom lights dimmed, and the last of the legal teams filed out, Port Charles itself seemed to pause. For all the power plays and family feuds that had defined this town, the fall of Willow Tate was a grim reminder of just how unforgiving truth can be. Her story, once painted with hope and resilience, now stood as a cautionary tale, that in a world of secrets and shadows, the truth doesn't just set you free, it leaves nothing standing in its wake.